We found you, John.
There we go.
I think John and I matched today.
What is that image on your shirt?
It's roses.
Oh, cool.
Some
I have
sort.
watermelons.
So I do see we've got a couple of other folks in attendee. I'm not sure who all is supposed to be panelists at this point, but I do see Sue.
I don't think she's supposed to be a panelist at this time. So maybe if we just want to get the meeting started, and if she needs to be promoted, we can do that at that time.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and go. Let's take the roll and get started.
Okay. Chair Rogers,
Here.
Member Sweathelm,
Here.
and Member Sawyer.
Here.
Let the order reflect that all subcommittee members are present.
Great. We'll go ahead and go to item number 2, which is our public comment for non-agenda items. So if you're interested in speaking on items that are not listed on today's agenda, now is the time to go ahead and hit the raise hand feature on your Zoom. And I'm seeing no live hands. Did we have any pre-recorded voicemail?
No emails were received.
Excellent. We'll go on to approval of the minutes. We have minutes from May 13th. Council members, did we have any amendments to those minutes?
No.
Okay, let's go to the public, see if anybody had any amendments that they wanted us to make. And seeing none, we'll adopt those without objection. Now we'll go on to item 4.1. This is Alan.
Yes, sir. Chairman Rogers, members of the subcommittee. The presentation I'm going to provide for you now is one on one-time monies. We have done a similar presentation before. This one, we have a couple of other objectives to it. First off, we want to, be a little bit clearer on what, when we talk about one-time monies, what are actually there that are have a broad uses attached to them versus those that are very restrictive in their use. I also want to go a little bit into the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and what we are experiencing going through that that law and those regulations, and then go over some next steps on where we are moving forward with that. So with the next slide, please. So really the one source of one-time funds, I know in the past we've shown you a pie chart of $200 and something million worth of one-time funds. What you're looking at in the real sense of one-time broad use dollars are the PG&E funds that came in. And what I have here is just a pie chart that shows what we've done with this before. And if we go on to the next slide, I've broken it out for you in more of a chart fashion here, or a table fashion. So we received $95 million, and that should actually be July of 2020. Of that, the council made certain commitments and certain appropriations. So I'll start with the commitments part. So during the goal setting sessions in February, the council committed $40 million to the general fund reserves for fiscal stability, the match to the county commitment to RED in the amount of $10 million, and then an amount to the Roseland Library of $10 million as well. In addition, the council appropriated in April, the end of April, $8 million of fire resiliency projects, the vegetation management, and the wildland resiliency and response strategic plan. So if you're looking at it from a obligation and commitment standpoint, we have the $40 million in reserves are in reserves. The $8 million of fire resiliency projects are in projects with the fire department, and they are using those funds toward that end. And then we have items, the committed ones for the Red and the Roseland Library. Those are set aside, but they're waiting for a specific appropriation from council, and that takes a council action that has a resolution and officially appropriates the money into those projects. But they are set aside for that use, so when that happens, the money is there for that for that specific action.
And Alan, can you remind me too, and I apologize, I know I've asked this like 4 times. My recollection is that the one-time funds, PG&E settlement funds and others, technically are special fund and then don't count towards our Measure O baseline. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct. And finally, all of this leaves about $27 million of PG&E funds uncommitted. So those will be, an accounting term for that is assigned in the general fund. A way of looking at it is that it's just set aside for use. The only way that they can be used is through council action. So those funds remain uncommitted to any particular project, but set aside waiting for a project should one come to the council. Next slide.
Alan, can I just jump in and ask a quick question through the mayor? Do those, so they're uncommitted, do they sit as a line item inside the general fund, or do they sit outside of the general fund?
So they,
Where do they live?
they live within the general fund, but outside of our general fund calculations.
Okay, so if we were to, which I'm not necessarily expecting, but if we were to not come to agreement or strongly agree to where those funds might be committed, could they indeed be committed to our general fund until we, into our reserves, until we found a suitable, given where we're going fiscally, if we were to decide to up that 40 mil and leave more in the reserves, would that be a potential use of those funds to increase those reserves?
Yeah, you could do that. Those funds remain assigned until we receive direction to do something with them otherwise. And if otherwise means putting them just as part of the overall reserves and that and our general reserve calculation, then we can do that with direction from council.
The reason I ask is we are moving into a lot of unknowns with our next budget, and I'm just, that it would be important for the council to hear that that is, just because we put in 40 million, which could go away pretty quickly, that it is not without benefit to consider boosting our reserves beyond that 40 million. So it's just as a reminder, I guess.
Understood. So next slide, please. Unless there are any other questions about that. All right. So now we move into the what we've been calling one-time monies. They are one-time monies, but they really have restricted uses around them. And this chart, what I've tried to do is break them into our fire recovery and mitigation grants, and our response to COVID. So this chart shows the pie chart that if you look at it, most of the fire recovery and mitigation grants are related to the Tubbs Fire in FEMA PA for both the general fund and the water. If you go to the next slide, I kind of break that down a little bit for you. So, so for FEMA public assistance funds, the cost reimbursement for responding to the fire has been received by the city. And so everything that was allowed by FEMA regulations to receive for an immediate response to the fire in both the first 30 days and then 31 plus days, we've received those dollars back, and they've been receipted back into the general fund, and that was or to the water fund, because we did differentiate those two funding sources, and that total was about $3.7 million. And then what we have left are a number of projects that are long-term recovery projects, rebuilding from the fire, both on the general fund side, meaning a lot of road repairs and signs and guardrails and those types of projects, plus parks projects and the like. And then you have your water projects where we're rebuilding a lot of our pump stations and reservoirs and things like that. So with these, the way that they work is that we received obligations from the federal government, from FEMA, of what they are going to pay for these projects. And so based on that, we develop a budget, and then as we go through certain milestones, we request money back from FEMA, or actually in this case, Cal OES flows through the state. So we put in a request for those funds, and they're approved, and they send us that reimbursement for it. So basically, it's a grant. It's just like any other type of grant drawdown for a project that's going on. And we have, like I said, we have those in the general fund, and we also have those in the water fund. Next slide, please. We also have a couple of other sources that one thing I will say about the FEMA PA ones, and you don't have to go back to the other slide, but it is an important aside. While FEMA obligates a certain amount and we budget to that amount, if it turns out that at the end of the project, we have eligible costs above that obligated amount, we will receive that through the closeout process. So what will happen is that we will go through a process with FEMA and Cal OES where we will validate all the costs above that which was obligated, and we will make adjustments to those already obligated projects, and then we would receive those extra funds back. What I'm not clear on, because we haven't gone through this yet, is whether that amount will be at the end of the closeout of that individual project or the end of the closeout of all of our projects. Because some of the things that FEMA does is that they will say that, yes, we will pay you this, but we pay you this at the very end when all other projects are done. And as you can tell, that could take several years from that to happen, if not decades. So now we can go on to the next slide. So we have fire, we also have grants through the HCD, which are actually community development block grants that are for disaster recovery infrastructure and mitigation projects. We were allocated $34 million of funding for that. There are very specific projects with this should go to the lion's share approved for Fire Station 5. The only one that was approved on both the disaster recovery and the mitigation side of that. There are other projects, but again, that HCD has approved on our behalf as eligible for those funds, and it's up for the city to then go and prioritize how we would go use those funds, either from the DR source or the mitigation source. That said, the top priority of the city has been to rebuild Fire Station 5 with those funds. They are very specific as to the use, very specific. The process that we've gone through just to get to the allocation part has been, probably close to a year. And we are still moving through that process. It's very slow, and it takes a lot of work on our side and also on the state side. Then on top of that, we have hazard mitigation grant programs. So when a disaster happens, FEMA not only sets aside money for disaster recovery, but they also set aside a smaller amount of money for hazard mitigation grants. And so we applied for several of those. We've received some back. And then as just like with the PA projects, as we get through certain milestones, we will go and request reimbursements back that go specifically for those projects and cannot go back for any other use. On top of that, those projects are capped in terms of the dollar amount. So if the cost of the project ends up being more than the grant dollars allowed to us, the city would be on the hook for that delta. Anyway, unless there's any questions, I'll move on to the next part, which is dealing with COVID. So COVID, I broke into three main areas, and on the next slide, I'll go through that. The largest amount is ARPA funding. Since this is COVID relief, I thought that it was appropriate to have it there. We also have, we are doing a FEMA emergency response project. And then we have already received and used coronavirus relief funds, which was from the initial CARES Act that flowed through the state to us. So next slide, please. So like I said, we received an allocation of a little more than 2.1 million of coronavirus relief funds that did flow through the state. And what we were able to do with that is apply it to our emergency response. And then that went into then we received the money back from the CRF, and we were able to use those general funds into a child care pilot program, which is just currently being used. About $2 million went to that program. The American Rescue Plan Act is the, well, actually, let me do the FEMA PA one first, and then we'll get into the ARPA. So the FEMA PA, we've been working with FEMA and Cal OES on this since for a year. I think we put in our request for public assistance in May of last year, so we're over a year. And I think I'm on my 4th or 5th FEMA project manager. And every time they come in, we kind of go back to square one. So we are still at the point of validating costs just to get the project obligated so that we can go and close it out. That's where we are. The majority of the costs that we're looking at with that are those for the non-congregate sheltering at the Sandman, and our material supplies for PPE and our response, initial response toward COVID that we didn't apply toward the CRF funds. So we're using FEMA as kind of the catch-all for those activities that couldn't be covered either by CRF funds or by CDBG or by any other federal funding source. One of the things to keep in mind as we go through all this is that the federal government looks very poorly at double dipping and hitting the same source with, or different sources for the same activity coming in. So we have to, as staff, be very careful that we identify exactly where the funding source is coming in for what activity and keep that segregated out. So we've been working closely with Housing and Homeless Services to make sure that we are catching those costs that are solely there, that can't be covered by anything else. And that's what we have for the FEMA PA. For the ARPA, so we are, this is I'll be quite frank, it's a challenging piece of legislation to go through. So what we are doing is not only attending whatever forums that we can get. I have a standing Monday forum with GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, where you have folks nationwide, and all we're trying to do is solve this particular piece of legislation and understand exactly what we can use it for, what we can't, how we go through some of the revenue calculations, and wherever possible to try to cobble together some best practices to ensure that when we are audited, that our audit risk is minimal. It's a fluid law. While we do have an interim guidance, it seems like weekly we receive more or additional guidance on that rule coming from the Treasury. So what they're doing is they're hearing from cities and counties and states, and they are adjusting their guidance to either make things more clear for us, hopefully allow for more uses of the funds. But like I said, it's a fluid thing. So we are, our consultant that actually is helping us with Fire Station 5 and navigating through the CDBG, DR, and mitigation, they also do work in terms of understanding the eligibility of the programs. So I've reached out to them to see if we can have them help us, kind of put a third set of eyes that are on it to ensure that we're doing things correctly, that we're using the right calculations in that. We also, we are working on our revenue. In fact, actually, let's go to the next slide. So we are looking at our revenue calculations now. We're currently doing those in finance. It's a pretty, it's turning out to be a pretty labor intensive job. One, because they are looking offside of our normal fiscal year end closures. So they are looking at December 31st. So they're kind of taking a calendar year approach as opposed to a fiscal year approach. It just makes pulling the records that much more difficult because you're actually kind of crossing fiscal years. You have half of it has been audited, the other half has not. That isn't a problem for Treasury, but it does make things a little bit more difficult. The importance of doing the revenue calculation is that for those things that if we can certify revenue lost through the pandemic, and again, what Treasury looks at is the city as a whole governing entity, so they're not going source by source. I can't go to them and say, we lost $3 million in TOT, so that's our revenue loss. They consider the whole package. And that again makes things difficult. But I guess I would look at it this way. If the revenue loss that we are able to calculate, those funds of all of ARPA, those funds would have the broadest uses available to them. So to put it this way, of the $34 million, let's say that $4 million we can certify as being lost revenue. We could use those funds for virtually any government service. They're very broad in how they define the uses for that. However, the other 30 million would need to be used to the very restrictive uses as defined by the act. So we are hoping as we go through, we're being very diligent with that revenue calculation, because there's the potential for us to have some very wide, broad use dollars versus some more restricted dollars. Let's see here. Next slide, please. So, and where we are with the next steps, I kind of merged some of that in here, but we do have another study session in front of the full council on July 13th. By that time, we will have our calculations done for revenue loss. We will hopefully have a consultant on board to be able to look over our shoulders at the programs that staff is currently coming up with that may be able to fit within the restrictions of ARPA. We will go through a review process and then be able to provide that to you in July. As I say that, I realize that that's a month away, but that's our time frame. We do have some reporting requirements along with ARPA in that I need to present to Treasury a interim spending plan by August 31st. So while July 13th is a fastly approaching date, the August 31 is also fastly approaching, so we have no real choice in the matter other than to get our ducks in a row as we move forward with that. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I can answer hopefully any questions that you have.
I like the qualifier there, Alan. That makes sense with some of the complexities of the regulations around each of these fundings. Council, who wants to start? Go for it, John.
I just have a housekeeping issue. Alan, just for the edification of the community, those that might be watching this presentation, ultimately, sometimes we use M for millions, sometimes we don't. We use 6 digits, and sometimes or 9 digits, and sometimes we don't use any indicator at all. But sometimes we say in millions. Could we just kind of add that in there, make sure that we are consistent in how we identify these amounts of money? it's a small thing, but it's as a frustrated editor, I like to be some, let's indicate that if we're talking about millions, let's say we're talking about millions.
Yeah, I'll make that more clear. Thank you.
Thanks. And otherwise, I don't really have any questions. Just, it's all kind of, this is all very, it's almost like funny money at times, like when we're going to get it, how much we're actually going to get. And like Sean always said, if we're wrong, there's a good chance that what our expectations are off. So I don't believe it till I see the check.
Well, the nice thing with ARPA, and I failed to mention this, but we have received our first tranche of that. So we do have $17.3 million that we have put into a special revenue fund, and we will direct all projects out of that special revenue fund. And that is largely for reporting. That's kind of a best practice that I'm picking up. Of keeping your reporting very separate. It's easy for the auditors to come in. It's easy for us to send stuff over to Treasury. So I should have mentioned that earlier. Apologize for that.
And so is those funds, are they fully to replace funds that we have spent? There's no discretionary use of those funds for, how many of these, that 17.3, how much of that is really gone because we're recouping what we lost?
So I would look at this as completely, these are funds going forward. The intent of the law is to get money and really be forward looking with it. So the small part that's going to be tied to revenue loss, and unfortunately I do think it's going to be a small part in the grand scheme of $34 million, that can be used for virtually anything. The remaining of it will need to be used for, if we're doing projects, they need to be either water, sewer, or broadband projects. They're very tight with their, right now, they're tight with their definitions on that. But it could be used for things like homeless services, for grant programs. Ideally grant programs, because you don't want loans. You need to have them off your books by 2024. So doing a revolving loan does us no good. It's the idea is to get the money out in the economy, try to make either people or the economy whole. And so they've really kind of focused doing that.
So I appreciate that. And I'm not sure if you mentioned, did you mention the timeline when you first went over these numbers to us today?
I probably glossed over it. I think it was on one of the slides, but I don't know that I necessarily mentioned it. So I'll mention it now, is that we do have, we have the December 31st of 2024 to have the money spent, although they will allow for some lag in reporting up to 2026, but I would just take it as, as best as possible, have it off your books and spent by 2024. That's
okay. I appreciate that. And that is important information, because of that, lest the money burn a hole in our pockets. I don't expect it to be sitting there until 2026, but it would be good to have to indicate the time-sensitive nature of these funds.
It's also important to understand, and we did have it on the slide, but a couple more restrictions is that it can't be used to prop up rainy day funds or reserves. It can't go toward debt service. It can't go toward pension payments. If you're going to use it in a project, it needs to be a pay-go project. It needs to be those types of things. Again, like I'm saying, they want the money out on the street, being done either in construction or however. They don't want it sitting in city coffers any longer than it needs to be.
I think that would be really important information to impart when showing these funds, because it will help the council understand the nature of the funds and the restrictions, the conditions that are placed on these, wherever you can. Whether you need to expand the illustration or however you can do it, I think it is well worth mentioning those conditions because the time ticks fairly rapidly.
Yeah, copy that.
Thank you.
Tom, any questions?
Yeah, and some comments just to keep on the same thing that John was just talking. And Alan, I'm using my experience on the continuum of care with some of the money coming in Emergency Solutions Grant, where unfortunately that body has made some decisions that we need to spend it by July of 2021, right? And now we're feeling rushed because now all of a sudden it's going to a nonprofit to provide these services. Oh, we don't have the capacity. And now we're kind of, okay, then what happens? So I would just really support what John was saying. If we can have due dates and consequences if we don't meet those timelines, does it go back to whomever? That is, again, it hasn't been a real warm and fuzzy feeling on the COC board where we're feeling pressured to make a quick decision versus a good decision. And so and I'm not sure if this is the appropriate item, but I'm just going to go for it, like with the one-time monies. I know we had sought out feedback from community members as to how to expend some of the PG&E dollars, right? I also look at some of the FEMA requirements, and it really seems like some of the things our community members were asking for might be eligible to be paid for out of FEMA or these other buckets. Is there any way that staff has gone through or looking about the potential funding sources other than the PG&E settlement dollars, which we had total discretion on? In other words, wow, and let me just use that in Coffee Park, new sidewalks or infrastructure improvements. That was all categorized underneath the PG&E settlement dollars, but I'm thinking some of that may qualify for the FEMA. But again, I'm not a subject matter expert. So is someone on staff evaluating the potential ability if council chose to actually go that direction?
Yeah, and we, I know we have evaluated that in the past, and so we can pull that up for you pretty quickly. Not at this meeting, but we can absolutely get this to the committee. I do know that what we were focusing on with the PG&E money are those things that we either lost in appeal or were not part of initially approved FEMA PW projects. So again, looking at general fund last, so I think is what you're saying. We are trying to have those dollars either coming from FEMA or from whatever before even the PG&E dollars. But there were some projects in Coffee Park and some other areas that FEMA just denied, and so we need to try to pick that up in other areas.
Yeah, I would just ask if we could be consistent, because at our December 8th council meeting, there's actually a slide summary that says projects that could be funded through enterprise fund, another one for potential for state or federal funding, projects under appeal with FEMA. They categorize it, but I did not see the same analysis when we went out to the community with what some of our community members wanted to break it down into buckets. I would just think I would like that same information if we're going to go that level with staff evaluation about what our needs are. We also ask the community for their feedback. I think we should do the same process so that council understands, okay, this bucket, that bucket, the other bucket may be able to fund these projects that at least some members of our community are interested in completing. And those are the only questions I had, questions/comment.
Right, thank you. And then Alan, kind of piggybacking on that, we did have an initial conversation about what the community would like to see from the PG&E funds. We also have now some other unrestricted or even slightly restricted funds. When we have that conversation in July, how much of an opportunity is there going to be for council members, for department heads, and for community members to bring forward ideas for funding? And how is the process going to work? Is it going to be we bring forward an idea and then staff tries to match it to a pot of money that it could be eligible for? Or is it going to be, we have this much money, let's stick to trying to come up with ideas that work?
I think to make the best use of our time at that study session would be that we do that analysis for you and include those things. So yes, you're right. There's a huge list of of projects that either the community asked for or staff asked for as a part of one-time dollars. We now know exactly kind of what we're looking at in terms of one-time dollars. And so you're able to kind of help prioritize that. And like you say, get them in the right buckets and go in there. I think that we need to have that as a review mechanism. Well, I would suggest that we do that as a review mechanism as the staff level, and then be able to bring that to the study session and go through it that way. We just don't have, I think that's the best way to go about that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because it was a while ago that we talked about that. There are other ideas that are out there. And I'll just, I'll tip my hand a little bit. One of the ones that I've been thinking about quite a bit for a while was a pilot project or pilot program in Santa Rosa around universal basic income, which I would never have suggested the PG&E funds for, because I view those as mostly fire recovery and fire resiliency. But then now that we have American Rescue Plan that specifically wants to push out money into your community for economic development as well as social safety net, it seems to me like that's a good nexus for conversation. So that's the kind of thing where I'd like to put that on the table for discussion. We haven't had a forum to put things on the table for discussion for ARPA. And so is the study session going to be where we broaden it? Or do you envision that you'll want from, again, department heads and the community and council members, those ideas ahead of time to be able to say, here's this idea and here's where it might fit in the funding? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm pausing because I'm just thinking of the timelines.
While
Yeah,
you pause, Alan, while you
I'm
pause,
sorry.
can I ask Chris, what is that?
Sorry, John. So
Sounds like a black hole to me.
Universal basic income, you've got some pilot programs that are going on around the country, and basically what they do is they target resources to people who are far below the poverty line. So, like, for example, I know Marin County is looking at one where they're targeting specifically single parents who live at 25% of the area median income or below, and guarantee them, I think they're looking at $200 a month. That's unrestricted. They can use it on food for their kids. They can use it on rent that they're behind, just basically a baseline of some form of social assistance. And then they're measuring the health outcomes for folks. So obviously it's not the kind of program you roll out with, if you haven't tried it, it's obviously not the kind of thing where we have enough funding for. But given that there are significant categories in ARPA that are both economic development, which I always think of putting money in the hands of poor folks in our community as economic development, as well as social safety net programs, it seems like the kind of thing that we could actually talk about, whether the council wants to do it or not, given that that's an opportunity that has presented itself to us.
Yeah. And it does speak to the determinants of health. So I'm a little curious about that.
So
Thank you.
I would suggest that if there are thoughts like that, and I made note of it, so I can have that. I think that those are types of things that if staff knows this in advance of that, it allows us to be able to vet its eligibility, and to be able to, then you can have that discussion of, yes, it's an eligible project, and whatever would be needed to put in there, that's a different discussion. But I think that it would get to it would be difficult for us to be able to act on the fly on some projects, especially ones like that, at a study session, and then we'd have to come back, and then you kind of see that happening. So I think maybe, and I have a feeling that after this meeting, I'm going to get some notes from the city manager, but maybe it would be best that if Jan and I reach out to the city manager and really kind of map this out and be able to, see how we can solicit that input coming back in prior to the study session. Again, so we can make the best use of our times during that session.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Alan. And I also want that opportunity to be extended to other council members and community
Right,
members
right.
and department heads, specifically or staff on what their priorities or what they see are. And so I'm wondering, and take this back and talk with the city manager, I'm wondering if we should schedule almost a public hearing, the council meeting before we actually have the study session and the allocation of this, literally just to take in ideas and listen, not to discuss the merits of them, but open it up and create a forum for things to be put on the table, so that way you can come to us in the study session and say, here was this idea. If the council wants to do it, it would fit into this bucket. Here's this idea. We can't find any particular type of funding that it would qualify for, just so that we have a little bit more clarity in that conversation.
I will absolutely bring that up.
Great. Any other questions, John or Tom? All right, let's go to public comment and see if we have any questions or comments on item 4.1. I'm not seeing any hands raised.
There was
Perfect.
no public emails.
Love it. Thank you. All right, thanks, Alan. We'll go on to our next item then. And I believe that's Jan's taking this one, right, Jan?
Yes. So this is a dense topic, and so you're going to have to bear with me as we talk through this. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk today is, addressing the city's unfunded liability. And I thought it was really fortuitous that the subject came up on Tuesday as we were talking about sort of highest and best uses of monies, but also sort of in taking care of these really sort of bigger challenges. And, the unfunded liability, I think, for impact and financial results, we've got to start proactively thinking about it. I've been thinking about it, frankly, since I got here, but only decided, to advance the strategy, particularly having gone through the budget exercise and, the cost association every year that's increasing with this. If we can go to the next slide, please. So let me say that the charts sum up the problem we are attempting to solve. And I think we've solved it, at least mathematically. So the city has an unfunded liability. Think of it as a past due bill on pensions owed, related pensions owed to CalPERS. And so in addition to normal costs, and you'll see that on the next slide, we have this unfunded liability payment that's about $30 million a year and rising. And in fact, it's rising from now until 2031. And throughout that period of time, which you'll see on this, this is the carve out beneath that you see of just that portion of the rising portion of the unfunded liability. That total over the next 10 years is $110 million. And that's in addition to the funds we pay to CalPERS for current employees. So our total unfunded liability you'll see it on the next slide, which is really the unfunded liability less assets is currently 400 million. We make that payment, we call it a discount rate or the actuarial assumed rate at CalPERS at 7%. It was $30 million in the coming budget year. And like I said, it's increasing each year. It peaks in 2031. And over the next over that time period, it's about an additional $110 million over the next 14 years. So our goal in this financing is, how do we levelize that that payment stream to CalPERS? And so how do we sort of get rid of the rising component of it and just levelize it so we're not having that increased liability? We talked about it during the budget. If nothing else happened, if the budget were in balance next year, it would be out of balance by about $4 million just to fund this portion of the liability owed to CalPERS. Next slide, please. So this is sort of the summary of the unfunded. We're only talking unfunded liability. We're not talking about the normal payments that we make to CalPERS every year. So for the unfunded liability, there are 63 different amortizations related just to this. It's very confusing. I didn't bother to show the chart, but think of it. Every year you have the possibility of either a benefit or a loss in CalPERS. Those all become amortizations. And so in a current year like ours, where CalPERS is expected to have really positive returns because stock market's having very positive returns, that's probably likely that will be another amortization, but it will be on the benefit side of the balance sheet. So in the left margin, you see the net unfunded liability. We've got an accrued liability of $1.34 billion and market value assets of about $946 million. So the difference between the two is a current unfunded liability. As I mentioned before, we pay normal benefit costs to CalPERS. It's as a percentage of payroll plus the amount required for the unfunded liability. And that's for miscellaneous, fire, and police units. And so you can see that each of those has a different funding status. You know, the conversation happened the other night. You know, is that viewed positively to have better funding status? And of course, the answer is yes. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about is, can we do a financing borrowing at a lower rate than our CalPERS discount rate? CalPERS discount rate, as I said, is about 7%. This would be a taxable financing, so it's slightly higher rates than tax-exempt financing, but still materially better than the 7% implied rate we're paying to CalPERS. So one, it's issued at a lower rate than the CalPERS assumed earning rates, which is currently 7%. It would produce cash flow and budgetary savings. We would actually be replacing the unfunded liability with lower cost debt, i.e. a financing, than higher cost debt, which is at 7%. We could sort of call this in the business, so to speak, sort of higher and best uses of money. And so when one of the questions was raised, should we think about PG&E dollars? That, for example, it would require some analyses, but of how you could replace higher cost debt with funds that, were either a lower cost of capital or in this particular instance, not a cost of capital. So it's the difference between the payment streams of the existing payment stream we now have to CalPERS, less some other mechanism, whether it's POBs or other monies that would create debt service payment savings. Obviously, it's a financing and as well, possibly budgetary savings. Next slide, please. So here are the potential benefits to the city. Clearly it will depend on what actually happens in the market were we to carry out a financing. You know, right now, I think our analyses assumed we could finance it at just about 3.2%, but, obviously will depend on what actually happens on the day of sale or the day we come to market. Budgetary and cash flow savings, as we talked about on the prior page, but there are also some market timing considerations. We would expect that it would produce an overall economic effect on the city's program, as any investment gains result in a surplus. I talked about that amortization. Conversely, any market losses, which is the case now that CalPERS has, also adds back to the liability. And of course, the time value of money, the more we have in the fund, the more compounding it is, and the more effect it has towards the overall position of our liability. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of the financing scenario at which we looked. And I'll talk about full funding a little bit later, because I think we shouldn't do full funding, but this was a full funding scenario. Here's a par value, $401 million for a term of 23 years. That's the amount remaining on the CalPERS liability, so we wouldn't go past it. Average annual debt service would be materially lower than what we're now paying for the unfunded costs to CalPERS. The really big benefit out of this is that we have the opportunity to avoid that additional $110 million we talked about by levelizing debt service. It also means that debt service would be higher in some years now where it is lower, but overall, it's not going to have that increasing effect that is usually budgetarily challenging. And on a net present value savings basis, it's about $123 million, meaning in today's dollars, that's the value of the financing, and we would finance it at estimated at a TIC of 3.2%. Next slide, please. Next. So just here's a sketch of how this all works. We would make the deposit into the pension system. The city would also pay debt service on the bonds. POB proceeds go straight into the pension fund. They go out to pay retirement benefits. This is just a sketch of what it would look like, the process for getting funds to CalPERS. Next slide, please. I have to disclose risks. There are some. Investment risk. So for this financing to work, there's actually a slide. I'm not going to go to it, but it'll come up as we get to the end of the presentation that shows what the current returns for CalPERS have been over, I think, the past 10 years, what the returns have been. And some have been higher, some have been lower. But again, there's always a potential that, CalPERS investments may not perform. But obviously, the lower borrowing costs, the better chance we have for investment performance, given the 3-point spread between the 7% if we were to borrow, or actually it would be about 4.5%, or if we were to borrow in the 3.5% range. So depending on market timing, there are certain impacts to the economics of the overall transaction. Clearly, I think putting in a lump sum payment at one time would be helpful, but investment losses, if they were to happen on the front end shortly after funding, that might have some detriment effect to the overall cost benefit of the program. Conversely, one of the discussions we have is when should we fund? So we're in a really good sort of market cycle right now. Investment returns are very high. And so there's some argument to be made if you do it in tranches, not all at once, maybe in a market such as this, maybe in a market that, sort of when returns are less, then you sort of average into the market over time. Loss of flexibility, I don't think, we need to, actuarial assumptions certainly change over time. Borrowing rates are set for the life of the bonds unless refinanced. So, if interest rates were to decline, we might have the opportunity to refund it. But yes, that would be, one of the things for consideration. We always advise people that you can never know the true economic outcome of the pension financing vis-a-vis the liability of CalPERS, because it's really sort of a tally over time. So in 30 years or in 23 years, when, the amortization period should come to an end, that really is through, the sort of overall evaluation of the whole program. We can do it on a bit by bit basis, but it's really sort of at the end, sort of looking back, how did the program do overall? Next slide, please. Overfunding is one that I think we learned a lot about after the first generation of pension bonds. We put in, sort of those who did full funding, they put in, fully funded the liability only to have in a good performance year from CalPERS that you didn't really get the benefit of anything more. And so it creates an actuarial surplus. And, I think, that's why we've come to the recommendation that perhaps doing a financing in tranches is sort of better than doing it all at once. Credit risk, this is one where, we sort of got this figured out. So the rating agencies have different perspectives about pension bonds. Some view it negatively, specifically Moody's and Fitch. Standard & Poor's doesn't really have an issue, so they're neutral on pension obligation bonds. So our answer to that is we'll just go to Standard & Poor's and leave the other two out of it. So I think if you look at most POBs, that's what's happened. I think we would respond the same. The loss of flexibility, I think, is an issue that's gone away with GASB 68. It used to be the conversion of what was seen as a soft liability to a hard liability. That is no longer the case because this now has to be on our financial statements at mark to market every year with our financial statements. Next slide, please. So here are some risk mitigation strategies. I've sort of touched on them as we've gone ahead. Issuing less than the full amount so we don't, have that overfunding from an actuarial perspective. Multiple tranches that allow us to dollar cost average into the market, perhaps catch the market at, also in item 3, different market cycles, low market cycles for equities, preferably, and mitigate credit and market risks by ensuring adequate spread between borrowing and the earnings rates. So taxable rates were much higher during the first generation of POB issuance. So you had much more chance of sort of butting up against the actuarial assumed rate. If we were to issue today, we're at roughly 1/2 of the CalPERS rate. And I think that gives really some margin for error there in terms of the spread between rates. I don't think anybody adds complexity to these transactions anymore. It's pretty much plain vanilla fixed rate bonds. And, my recommendation would be that we sort of, if we're going, if there's a decision, to move forward with a pension financing, you tee it up. We've got a prop validation process to go through, have it ready, and, wait for, favorable market conditions. Next slide, please. Actually, we can skip past this, but, this is sort of, You've seen portions of this, but yeah, we can skip past this. Next slide. So there are a variety of strategies, budgetary strategies. So the comment about, for example, here's a good budget strategy, whether or not PG&E dollars could be used to make a dent in the unfunded liability. That would be a budgetary approach. From a recycling savings, as you have savings, assuming they're cash flow savings, could we then recycle it, meaning use it to even buy down further the liability? Other issuers have gone to the pension stabilization fund. This could be part of what we incorporate into our general fund policies, that perhaps if there's an excess in 1 year, we put it in a pension stabilization fund to buy down the unfunded liability. On the financing side, leverage refunding is where you take all your savings up front. I don't think that would be a good strategy for us to do, either from a credit perspective or otherwise. Then there's a whole tax exempt exchange. And if this sounds complex, probably sounds more complex than it is. One of the questions I asked, I think when I, first was coming in and, looking at the fire station, for example, which is budgeted with PG&E dollars, was to whether or not, should we take care of higher cost debt and do something else where we can do lower cost. So, for example, a fire station, essential asset, financed on a tax exempt basis, would there be some benefit to looking at that and, sort of making alternate use of funds? And this particular recommendation, which most people have done, issuing pension obligation bonds. Next slide, please. That's just an example of a leverage refunding. It's up front. Next slide. So we've had the conversation, or we've had a few conversations. Are we better off using pension obligation bonds or a COP issuance? And let me tell you why that is. So pension obligation bonds, we're required to file, a validation is required to be filed with the courts. It takes about 4 to 6 months. However, there are a lot of recent challenges to validations. The most recent is one for the city of Chico, which was sent to us this week just to see it, in which it was challenged by the Jarvis Group. Sometimes they just go away, but many cities choose not to litigate it, and so they flip to the alternative, which is COPs. The issue is
Jan, I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you. What is the validation? What is the validation? I don't understand.
So the validation is whether or not the CalPERS obligation is an obligation that the city must subscribe to. Is it an enforceable obligation, or does the city have a choice? And so so you can't get, so bond councils want to sort of open that in the courts because they won't issue an unqualified opinion without it. And so it's a lawsuit as evident that's filed, essentially. And if there are challenges to it, then clearly most are choosing to go with a different strategy, but it has to do with whether or not the CalPERS obligation is truly an obligation enforced, or does the city have a choice? And that's an unanswered question, and it's a gray area.
So are they basically, so that's strange to me. I'm trying to process that. I thought it had something to do with, can the city prove its need, that this is a fiscal need to do pension obligation bonds to help survive the next 23 years. So this actually is a legal question as to whether or not CalPERS, whether that's really a legal obligation.
Or do you have a choice to do something different?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't claim to understand the legal ins and outs of it, but my understanding is that's really sort of the substance of where the challenge lies. It's an unanswered question.
Yeah.
And so what I have talked about with counsel, legal counsel that is, clearly the challenge is there are lots of pension obligation bonds that were issued without challenges. There's a whole list in the appendix, which I won't read through the list, but you should look at everybody who's done pension obligation bonds. So clearly the challenge is still somewhat an exception to the rule. Having said that, they are becoming more frequent. Recently, just one was filed against I think Chico was in the validation process, and there was one filed by the Jarvis Group. So when the validation is filed, that's about a 4 to 6 month process. But we actually think it does make for a little bit stronger credit, and there's good reason why we would not necessarily go to first the certificates of participation, because if you're doing a big pension financing, some of these are really big. But let's just say we were doing full funding, 400 million, for example. That would be a challenge in having an essential asset to serve as collateral for the city. And what we've talked about at the city, if we were to be able to do this, was one regarding using streets as an essential asset. It's certainly been done before. Sewers, for example, another essential asset. Let me also say there was a recent article, in the last year, I'm going to say, just an article in the paper about someone being critical about using sort of those assets or not having anything else. So it does matter. And of course, there's a time value of money associated. We can just as easily pull the trigger on a certificate of participation than wait 6 months to do a pension obligation financing. That has an associated cost with it. And there are court costs also for filing really the litigation of the validation. So that's really the decision portion that's represented here on this slide. And what issuers are beginning to do, I can't say most, what they are doing is they're paralleling both processes. So they do documents for the pension obs, and they do documents at the same time for the COPs. You file the validation, and if there is a court challenge, most of them will wait it out. If there is a court challenge, then you immediately flip to the COPs. So that's one way of, how we might think about approaching it.
Okay. So there is a little bit of the rolling of the dice on the validation.
There is. Right. I wouldn't say it's a lot, but I would say it exists.
Yeah.
And we would, yeah. So okay. Next slide, please. The next slide. So look, I actually have the distinction of being, I think, the first consultant in California to have done pension obligation bonds when I was at PFM for one of my clients. And, it's really hard to sort of get around the argument of why one should do, pension obligation bonds. First of all, they're just a notch below the typical GO level. I think there's an argument to be made, will reduce our costs, budgetary, and as well as financially, and that savings relief is really very much needed. We also, one of the things I really didn't focus on is, in addition to the stream of payments being lesser to CalPERS, we also were able to create about $3 million in what I call headroom, or sort of budgetary relief that's above, where the savings to CalPERS is. And that really sort of begins the compelling argument it's a smaller part of the two, but it's a big one if you begin to think about how are we going to manage the budget deficit on an ongoing basis. The opportunity of both of those things to, save money is really substantial. I think, the potential impacts for the system, clearly would be a large infusion of cash for making new investments. It increases the funding ratio, which is a plus for bargaining units, and it reduces reliance on the city's contributions going into CalPERS. Next slide, please. I sort of talked about it on this slide. So I didn't realize, I thought I'd slip past it, but in the blue, in the middle, right above the gray, you see it's the budgetary savings part. That's the $3 million created above the savings from levelizing the pension obligation, the existing unfunded liability structure right now. So those are really two very good outcomes. Next slide, please. So I think most of us think of POBs sort of in two generations. There was a first generation of POBs that were done. We talked about, people try to fully fund the liability, thinking it would entirely go away. That really wasn't the case. All sorts of structures were done, variable rate structures. I think we found that fixed rate makes it simple. Standalone POBs were, as I mentioned, not necessarily viewed as a credit positive, particularly by two of the rating agencies. But I think they've come a long way since then. Tricia, if we can, the second part of the slide. So in the right-hand column, it addresses, the risks that were sort of in the left. We talked about increasing the debt burden, for example. That's gone away with GASB 68 reporting requirements. So taxable bonds for municipal issuers used to be they didn't have something called callable bonds in the taxable market. The taxable market is usually made up of, other buyers other than municipal buyers. We have the tax exempt market, but if it's for anything operating, then it's taxable. And this is partly operating. But now there's the 10-year call provision. So if there's a refinancing opportunity and these bonds are outstanding, we would have the opportunity to call the bonds and refinance them. We're not proposing to extend the term of the unfunded liability. It would be the same as it is with CalPERS. Credit neutral, I think, from a Standard & Poor's perspective. And I think part of the strategy needs that we dollar at cost average into the market. Next slide, please. And just very quickly, I got a comment back from bond counsel today. He said, Jan, this will take you a little bit longer. But this is, sort of the steps in the process, validation being the lengthy component of it. But we would have to wait until probably 6 months today to do that if in fact we're using the POB strategy, which I do think we should pursue, but also think of, some other risk mitigating strategy. Next slide, please. This is, sort of the judicial timeline here, and it frankly probably may be a little bit longer, but I just included it to show, sort of what the steps in the process are. And the next slide. Tricia, just go to the next one. This is the chart I do want you to see. CalPERS history over the past 10 years. And CalPERS is expected to return 18 to 20% in 2021. I think the one area of sensitivity is for those of us, it's been a long time ago since Standard & Poor's made the comment that the CalPERS actuarial rate should be in the vicinity of about 6.5%. Actually, that was made right after the financial crisis. And so it's been a long time. And there's a reason why the pension funds are reluctant to do that. So every time you lower the assumed actuarial rate, that increases the liability. Because if you're lowering the return rate, you have the expectation that you're going to have not as aggressive performance on the assets. And so, but they're very slow to do that. That's been several years since that was talked about. I think at the time, CalPERS might have been at 8.5% or 8% for that matter. And so I think the discussion is, or what we've been hearing, is they might also lower the rate to 6.5%, perhaps, after these really positive returns, understandably, because the liability is going to grow at that point, and it would have been lessened under this. So anyway, that concludes the presentation. I know it's a lot to take in, and it's a difficult topic, but I think it's an important one for us to think about how we begin to address the unfunded liability.
And Jan, I used to know this data point off the top of my head. I think I'd heard it from one of our previous CFOs, but every time CalPERS lowers their assumption rate by 0.5 point, it adds, I think it was $20 million in cost to us.
And I don't know. I used to know it. I've sort of lost sight of it. And as soon as I made the comment tonight, I was like, oh, I should have known that number, but I don't. But I'll be happy to circle back with you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's I don't think it's particularly necessary for this conversation, but it was always good to have that data point to be able to talk to people about external factors having an impact on our long-term finances as well. I wanted to confirm, I think what I saw from you, and it's a number that I know that Tom and John also track, it looked like we're currently at 70% funded for our pension obligations.
Roughly. Yeah, depending on which system we're in. We just saw it here.
Yeah, I had 73.4 for miscellaneous.
It's about 70% funded across the board. Yeah.
We've heard that at a certain point, once the system falls below a percentage of funding, that's virtually unrecoverable. That once it becomes so underfunded that the financial mechanisms and tools that you have in place to try to recover are not available to you to do that.
Well, I think so. Here's the way I would answer the question. I would say that's probably true. But if you're at that level of underfunding, it also means you're sort of not keeping up with, the funding costs on an ongoing basis. But that usually that's as a result of other underlying financial issues. So they usually, or financial and budgetary issues. So those things sort of usually converge. But I mean, that's really the root cause is, budgetary stress, financial stress that makes it difficult or impossible to keep up with funding strategies. So.
Yeah, and we've also talked in the past about the impact that each of the cities, as they fall below, the risk that it puts on other cities who are still in the marketplace. Does moving to the pension obligation bond strategy, does that shield Santa Rosa a little bit from fluctuations with CalPERS based on, I'll use Petaluma as an example. I know that they're particularly hurt in their pension system right now.
Well, no, I'm trying to think of why that would be other than, sort of assets under management and how those are allocated. But other than that, I would have to ask CalPERS that question specifically to answer your question, because each system stands on its own and has its own amortizations. So I can only assume it's sort of a asset management strategy. And so perhaps just as we get bigger bang for the buck, the more money we have in our own system, that sort of, you know, gives you scale, I would think that that might hold true as well for others.
Okay. Tom, John?
A quick question. So a number of years ago, CalPERS put into place what there's a word that I can't think of they referred to. It started to soften the peaks and valleys of, and they call, is it spreading, or they referred to it as something that's kind of stabilized, mitigated some of this and turned it into this. Does that, do the POBs in a sense kind of soften the, given that they are a constant as far as how much we have to pay each year, does it create a predictability in our obligation? Even in taking into consideration the flow of the market, because there will be fluctuations in the market.
Well,
but
I mean,
our obligation would stay the same on an annual basis, would it not?
Well, you have your own amortizations, yes. And so, I mean, attributable to the city of Santa Rosa is what the city of Santa Rosa invests. Having said that, you know, CalPERS has a range of investment options. You know, ours are really boring. They got a wide range from equities to all sorts of things they're in. I think a lot of that over prior years, I don't know if that was, I think that was for other investment related strategies, but I think seemingly, you know, I don't know, I can't speak to what's different this year, except that we've all had, if you've got a portfolio, I think everybody's had really good returns. So everybody's had 18 to 20%. So is that out of the range of performance
So
of
what you're
the
saying is
general
if you have a
market?
portfolio where you haven't had good returns, it might be your own fault?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all had it. So yeah.
It's an interesting strategy. I'd be curious to know how many municipalities are considering this strategy right now.
A lot. It's in the appendix.
Okay, I did see a number of those.
Yeah, look, it's hard not to do it. Well, Santa Rosa already has, I forgot to mention, the Santa Rosa already has existing pension obligation bonds. We're just not touching it now. You already have POBs. Yeah.
I thought we did.
Yeah. And I thought the new city manager told me, yeah, he actually was on his watch that happened. Yeah.
And does that impact the offering at all, or the rate that we could get on them?
You mean your other POBs?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it'll be driven by market at the time we come to market. Yeah. I mean, what we hope so POBs are just a notch below the GOs. I would expect, you know, probably if we were doing a POB to come out at a AA minus. So yeah, and we haven't drawn those bonds are non-callable, so we can't refinance them. That was a reason. Yeah, we're not looking at them because they were one of the first generation POBs that I talked about, sold non-callable. So we can't call them, we can't refinance them. They have to remain outstanding. Yeah, or a tender. Yeah.
And I do have just sort of a practical question. With the bond ratings, you said you expect us to come out AA minus, and I'm looking at the appendix here, and I do see some A plus, some AAAs.
Well, it's off the GO rating.
Is that what it is? Okay.
It's off of even if you don't have outstanding GOs, it's an implied GO rating. Having said that, I'm going to caveat it away. So I don't know when the last time, I mean, rating agencies no longer require visits for official visits and the rating application. You know, they now do their own due diligence usually at the end of a fiscal year. and they will, and they're one of the best beneficiaries of, you know, the information and disclosure documents where we're now required to publish. And so, you know, I would say, I think I can't predict what the rating is. I can't predict what the response will be. One of the things I have spoken about that I am concerned about is, you know, sort of our budget deficits, because that becomes part of the, you know, I'll put that in the challenge column, because I would expect it to come up. So, but on the other hand, you know, if we're at Standard & Poor's and sort of having a neutral conversation, you know, part of what it becomes is, look, we're working on the budget deficit. This becomes a big, you know, part of the helping conversation, particularly if we're restructuring it in a way that doesn't extend it, levelizes it, and still, you know, gives good funding, and, you know, with some adoption of policies in place that the rating agencies would want to see. It's all of the above.
Okay. Yeah, and it does raise an eyebrow that our par amount out of everyone who's listed in the the 49 that are listed in the appendix, and then
It's big. No, and I don't think we'll do it. I think the real issue is we'll do it in a couple of tranches. Yeah.
Okay. Tom, any questions?
Well, it's kind of like, what's the next step in the process? So we get all this data, and, you know, I'm looking for the sound business decision. I like the tranche versus all in. Where do we go from here? What are you looking for from this subcommittee, and when does the council get to share the joy of this information?
Well, actually, I'll do this. I would love if you'd have some thoughts. I'd be, you know, what I would love to have come out of this meeting is, hey, Jan, we'd like to pursue this strategy. Can we do a study session with the council? So
I'm ready for that.
I'm sorry, what'd you say, John?
I'm ready for that.
Yeah.
Well, let's do public comment on this item first. Then we'll bring it back and see if that's the direction we want to give. So if anybody has comment on this item, go ahead and hit the raise hand feature. All right, I'm not seeing any. And
No public comment was received via email.
perfect, reading my mind. Let's go ahead and bring it back. John, I think I heard a motion from you. Maybe it was from Tom.
Well, I'll go ahead and move that we bring it back as a study session with council, and I will include in that motion that we make every effort to simplify the information to make it as digestible as possible, and especially when we talk about the minus and pluses, the risks and opportunities, making sure that the council is really clear on that, because I think that will move them in a particular direction as far as whether they want to go forward or not.
Yes, and I'm supportive of that. And for me, it's a business decision. So if we do this, and Jan, if you were, staff could clearly identify, if you do this, this is the desired outcome that we plan on having. This is the metric that will determine, is this course of action going to be successful? This is what we're looking for, and put it in, the plain English, because I think it's a dollar amount. Because it was always, having gone through some of these conversations, as has the rest of the council, with some of the refinancing of debt with, our enterprise funds. What always gets me is that there's someone, and I get the cost of money and the people who write all this stuff up, there'll be millions of dollars going to someone to do all this work that aren't city staff. I get it in the long run, and I would just ask that you show, by doing this now, it's going to save the city of Santa Rosa X number of dollars. Those dollars that will be saved, if it goes as planned, will enable us to fill in the blank.
All right, and I'm in complete
Yes.
agreement. I'll work with you, Jan, and the city manager to bring an item to council for discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for all your hard work, Jan.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go on to our next item and our last item. It's the 4.3 Measure O Public Safety discussion. Alan, welcome back.
Yep, thanks. So I will try to be very brief with this. Sorry about that, I was muted. At our last meeting, we talked about Measure O and the potential impacts if the public safety sales tax is not extended at the end of 2025. Next slide, please. So just as a quick overview, Measure O was, as it was known at the time, Measure O was passed in November of 2004. Just over 70% of the vote, generates around $9 to $10 million a year. The revenue is for specific purposes. It does not go in the general fund. It is a special revenue tax. And it has an ordinance 3-26 in the city code that governs the uses and just the tax in general. The ordinance does require the funds to be spent on enhanced services. There is an implementation plan that was developed back in 2004 and it's maintained today. Every year, if there are changes to that plan, the council votes on that. We have permissible uses defined and a citizen oversight committee that oversees the how the funds are used, as long as they are to intend that they meet with the permissible uses of the ordinance. The funding is split 40-40-20 with 40% going to police, 40% going to fire programs, and 20% going to what was known at the time gang prevention and youth services. We now just simply call that the Violence Prevention Partnership. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we were talking about on the next slide is that what would be the impacts, thank you, of that if it was to go away? Well, there are currently, for police programs, it funds the traffic and downtown enforcement, and there's also some technical service positions that are part of that dispatch, totaling 16 FTE with the majority of those being sworn officers. Fire services, they're all sworn, and it covers 10.25 people. It allowed us to expand our firefighting personnel. We were able to build 3 fire stations and still save up funds for additional fire stations with that, and bought special equipment. So while the fire stations, if the measure went away, the fire stations, those are capital assets, they would remain. It would just be staffing them would be what the issue would be. And then in the Violence Prevention Partnership and Youth Services, this is kind of a combination between community engagement, which is where the partnership lives, and recreation, which is where our youth services live. The two of those groups combine the final area of our of Measure O. It employs about 9 permanent positions. I will say there are a number of temporary positions, seasonal temps that staff the programs on the youth side. This is where our choice grants come from. And so not only are we doing youth programs out in the neighborhoods that are targeted to those neighborhoods and helping folks with a number of different helping kids have a number of different activities. But we also have the choice grants where we give money out to our nonprofits that also serve those. All of those things, because Measure O are special funds, would the funding source would be lost for that. So what that does is it presents a challenge to the city in that either A, they just simply go away with the funding source, or they would merge into the general fund, of which there is no source to do those. So that is that's just not something that would work from a financial standpoint. So I think this was the last slide I did include. We can go to the next one. Oh no, I did have this. So the revenue collection would cease March 31st, 2025. Some expenditures may continue as the balances exist, but ultimately would go away as there would be no revenue. Any positions tied to the program would be eliminated. So kind of illustrates what I was saying before. And now I believe the next slide. Yes. So community impacts. I actually included a number of those. I'm just having them as an appendix with this. I worked with all the program managers to know what those were. I figured that we would have limited timing in this one. So I wanted to have it in the presentation, but maybe not something that we necessarily talk about right now. Instead, opting to hit to the highlights of what those impacts are of the different programs. So with that, if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
John or Tom?
You know, for me, I'm not sure what feedback you want. I'm aware of all that we have. What I was hoping we could have the discussion, where do we go from here?
Yeah, so sorry about that. I blanked on that. So I have reached out to our polling group. I do have a proposal for a contract with them to do as we talked about the last time, the polling in July, August timeframe, education, informal education starting in January, allowing the kerfuffle of the recall election to kind of take place, but it still allow us to get going, do another set of polling toward June of 2022 to make sure that we're still on track, and then get to council in July of 2022 to get an item on the ballot for November of 2022. So from what I heard on the last time, which was there was a priority of having this extended. So I'm kind of moving along the area that we want to get our polling questions developed and get ready to get in place, and eyeing 2022 as the ballot as our goal to have that on the ballot in 2022.
So I guess I'm trying to think if this is a question or a comment, because I get the timing is very important, but also I'm significantly concerned about what we'll be talking about on June 22nd with the cuts to public safety. I think it was 6 police officer positions, 5 firefighter positions. So if that budget goes as submitted by the city manager in May, are these the same impacts? Specifically talking about, you know, the first slide that you talked about, some of those ancillary, not just patrol officer, you know, motor officers, downtown enforcement team. Is all of this making the assumption that we're losing those 5 police officer positions as outlined in the May preliminary budget?
So, well, the impacts that I'm talking about here are not in the general fund, and I believe the ones that you're talking about that are folded into the budget are simply general fund positions.
Right.
This is
So
in addition. Wouldn't this be in
exactly.
addition?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying is that, and having talked to the chief, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And that's where I'm thinking, depending upon, again, how the budget goes and what we decide on June 22nd. But I guess, and Chris, I don't know if this is something that the mayor sets up, but having some groups to start working on this, because I think the message does need to change. What we passed, what the voters voted for at the origination of Measure O is going to have to be different. And I get the polling. I could probably predict what the polling would come out with, but having a group of people talking about it and not at the last 15 minutes of a long-term financial planning and audit subcommittee meeting to actually start getting the work of this, because I think many of us who are engaged in this work understand the ramifications if Measure O does not pass. I think the big things are timing, and are we going to make any adjustments before we choose to go back to the voters? And I'm not sure how or when that would occur.
Yeah, and I think this is intended to start that conversation, Tom. So Alan is laying out what the polling looks like. And so I think for us, as we develop the questions, and Alan, when was the first poll suggested for? Was it August?
In the mid to late July to mid-August timeframe.
Okay.
He's
So
trying to catch that area before people go on Labor Day vacations.
Yeah, so I think we need to use that as an opportunity, Tom, to test a couple of different messages, including what the support level is for a reauthorization in 2022, even though it's more than a year out, and then testing, to your point about, are there changes that need to be made in the measure? What are the components of it that people are supportive of? What are the components that people aren't supportive of? And what are the needs of the city to be able to match up to those two conversations? I don't know where and how we do it. So what I do know is once we determine that we are putting something on the ballot, we stop talking about it, right? You've got an external committee that individuals from the city can be involved in, but the city can't use any of our resources on. But in the preparation of the ballot measure, we can. And so I guess my question for you, Tom, is what would you like to see next? If we've got this polling that's coming, would you like to actually see the poll in July? And that could be the main focus item for long-term finance, is for us to look at that poll and give the thumbs up on the poll on what questions we want to test, and then bring those results back and then chart a path from there about what the discussion looks like?
That's what I would like would be more community participation, because I'd venture to guess some of the choice grant awards over the last 20 years, if you told some of those, because, and again, it's part of a marketing issue just for Measure O, where a lot of people don't know, oh, I didn't know Measure O did this. Well, if we lose this, all of that's going to be gone, right? And so I'd love to hear the feedback, and also hearing from the recipients. I'd love to hear some police department staff positions who are funded from Measure O, fire department staff that are funded from this position. What are your thoughts? What questions should we ask? And not just have the three of us come up and give feedback to Alan about what questions do we want the pollsters, getting more of that total collaboration from the community, because we're going to need all resources to try to get this reaffirmed. And so and again, that's where I'm a little unclear as to whether it's, another subcommittee for just the Measure O to kind of have those conversations on a more regular basis, standalone, or continue with it as part of this. Honestly, Chris, I'm not really clear, because we are so early, and I know you talked about the timing of it, where 2024 might be that viable option. I know that scares a lot of people in the community. One and done, but
yeah, I hear you. Perhaps this is a discussion to be had at the full council level as well. And to your point, maybe we structure a study session where we can talk about exactly what Alan just laid out in terms of a timeline. If we were to go towards 2022, provides a space for the community to bring forward the stories, as well as bring forward any discussion about whether we need to change what that looks like, or if we even want to go and try to renew the measure. Yeah, I'm open to that if we want to have a study session on that at the council level.
I think it's going to be important to have a conversation about reforms and how, in many ways, reforms are separate from how many people you have providing the services to the community. The reforms are not dependent on reducing the number of officers on the street and having, in a sense, being able to separate those two conversations, because some people may be making an assumption that having that Measure O somehow supports a status quo. And we need to have some conversations about the reality of what's the benefits of Measure O, and they're really they're connected in a way, but one does not necessarily inform the other. You can have reforms without reducing personnel, and reforms are important. But there may be people that are connecting. If we reauthorize Measure O, then somehow we're ignoring reform. And I don't believe that, but I think we need that conversation is going to come up one way or in one form or another, I believe, and we need to be able to answer it and respond to it.
And it also is obviously tied as well. Everything we do with Measure O is tied as well with our equity, diversity, and inclusion work that we're trying to bring forward. So that sounds to me like a potential next step is, hate to keep adding work to the council workload, but a study session where we specifically talk through these different components and elements, the timeline, and start to formulate a discussion around whether 2022, whether 2024, or whether or not at all. But we've got to give an opportunity for people to weigh in, I think.
I think that would be helpful, even just as if you go through more of the community impacts with fire, a lot of the efforts that council has been talking about. Obviously, when Measure O first passed, we didn't have the Tubbs fire, but just, on slide 7, loss of funding for 9 positions, which is the loss of a full-time engine company, closure of a station. I don't know how many members of our council understand that's the gravity of which, if we do not go forward, a lot of what we've been asking for, even just some of the advanced life support stuff, one of our initiatives, everyone's supportive of this CAHOOTS program that we're working on. That's going to have an impact on that too. So it's complicated. So I think a study session and starting educating the community and our council, I think would be a good step. I'm sorry, Alan.
No, it's not a problem. So there's only two council meetings in July. So there's one on the 13th, I believe, and one on the 20th, if I read the calendar right. So let me do this. Let me put this on the list of the things that I need to reach back with Jeff on, city manager, and see kind of where we fit this in and how we get this going to where we can kind of keep the time flow going forward and still get that out there. Plus, just on the abundance of caution, I'll make sure what parameters that we have from a legal standpoint of what we're able to actually do in the study session. I don't think it's a problem. It doesn't sound any different than when we present our annual report. So I think that's what we're kind of looking at. But I just want to kind of double check there as well.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, Sue was watching this meeting, so she'll probably correct us and make sure that we don't overstep.
I'm sure I'm getting notes from a lot of people after this meeting.
One of the things too that I know, having been around back when it passed, there was, an independent group that actually was forming. Many of us know who was in charge of that. That takes time to identify because that person is passed. That takes time to identify this committee and get the people who are willing. A lot of work is going to need it to be done on this type of issue. And that's why my concern is we can't wait for the last minute because, look at some of the other efforts countywide where there wasn't that united group working to try to get this passed, just thinking, for whatever reason, they think it's automatically going to pass without a campaign. And I don't think that's going to be the case for us. So I don't want to wait too long to get all of our ducks lined up to actually do this in an aggressive fashion.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to public comment on this. And I see the chair of the Measure O Oversight Committee. Ellen, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I know you've all heard it from me already that I really think we need to act on this sooner than later. So I appreciate all the comments about that. John, you're absolutely right that there is already comments being made, are already comments being made at this the meeting last night, the Citizens Oversight meeting last night about reforms and reducing personnel being totally conflated. So I just hope that I'm really glad to hear you saying a study session is something that we could possibly pull together in July and start educating the public about the benefits of what we're doing and possibilities of things that we can change so that there's more of a comfort level with funding the police department with these funds. That's really all I needed to say. Are you all
Okay.
still?
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. That was quick. We'll see if there are any other hands that are up. I'm not seeing any.
No public comment was received via email.
Okay. Well, I think we've got some direction there, Alan. We'll work with the city manager and bring that forward. And then Tom, you and I could have a conversation too about some of the stuff that we can't do through council. How do we start to build some of that discussion? Okay. With that, right at 6 o'clock.
Can I make one more request or a recommendation?
Yep.
So when I got the invitation for this, it was scheduled for an hour. So could we either, when the invitation goes out, block out the 2 hours? Because I don't see I get the invitation for the agenda, so I have no idea how many items are there. Just for time management, it'd be wonderful, either smaller agendas or tell us to block out longer timeframes. So
That works. I think for the foreseeable future, I think that my mantra is going to be plan for more time, just because we've got so much that we're all trying to work on. But we'll make sure that we address that and get that fixed for the next one.
yeah, just send the additional hours. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep. And we, because we're butting up right up against the mayors and council members selection committee meeting. So next meeting, agenda items. I'll go ahead and I'll work with Alan on that, unless John or Tom have anything in particular that is nipping at them.
I will add that I believe on the 24th, there's a special meeting of this, and I believe it's for the red term sheet.
Mm-hmm.
So just as an FYI.
I don't need to add anything. Our plate is full.
Ditto.
All right, great. Then with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn. I'll see you all soon.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank-
Bye.